Welcome to the Leadership Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Jono White. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Clarity. We are an Australian-based consultancy that works with leaders around the world, and our passion is to invest in people to become everything they're meant to be in order to fill the world with healthy organizations that people love to work for and customers line up to buy from. The goal of this podcast is to invest in you and your leadership. If you're just joining us for the first time, then feel free to check out consultclarity.org. That's our website, consultclarity.org. We have so many free resources on there, the most popular being our 7 Questions on Leadership series. We've had more than 1,500 leaders from around the world in all different sectors give their in-depth answers on leadership, what books they love, what they found most challenging, the most meaningful stories, how they structure their time through the day. That's free, so go and check it out. And we'd love to interview you about your leadership. I believe you have advice from your experience, your context, and your life so far that is important and can help other leaders. It's also a great way to give back. It's free to get involved, and you can do so by going to consultclarity.org/7-questions-interest, or just Google consultclarity.org 7 questions interest and fill out the form that pops up. We have a free resource for you on our website. It's called Leadership Survival Guide. It's a 57-page ebook. It has interviews with 10 world-class leaders, and you can go to consultclarity.org. It's right at the top, and get that today. We also have a daily email that we send out to over 15,000 leaders, and that email contains the highlights, our best content from our podcasts, our blog, my book, the books that we're loving that are out there about leadership. It's also the best way to get access to our masterclasses and workshops before anyone else. And there's also exclusive and limited special options just for subscribers. And you can subscribe by going to consultclarity.org/subscribe. Now, my gift to you is to work incredibly hard to provide the best leadership content I can to invest in you and your leadership. So if you're finding our content helpful, if you find this podcast helpful, then your gift to me could be this. If you do find it helpful, then write a review or rate our content and make sure you subscribe or follow. I can't emphasize enough how helpful that is. It really does help us to get the word out there so we can invest in more leaders to become everything they're meant to be. It also means a lot to me personally when people like you and people in our community share our content on social media. So if you do that, then please do look for me, Jono White, to tag me, and look to tag Clarity on whatever platform you're on. And our team, including me, I'm always looking to see when people have mentioned us so that I can engage with you. And also we look at sharing content. So if you write something about something we've done, there's also a good chance we'll share that with our followers. So if you could do that, that is a massive, massive help as we try to invest in as many leaders as we can around the world. Last of all, you can check out my book about how to deal with difficult people even if you hate conflict. It's called Step Up or Step Out. It's available on Amazon. You can just look up Step Up or Step Out Jono White, or you can go to store.consultclarity.org/book and check it out there. I have coached leader after leader after leader, and in more than 50% of the sessions, this topic comes up. How do I deal with this person? I'm finding it really difficult, and I just want to find a way that doesn't blow up to just to have a difficult conversation, to lead them better. How do I do that? There's a 3-step process that I outline in this book that I believe can help you. Okay, let's get into today's episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast. Today's guest is Simon Schrapel. Simon is Chief Executive at Uniting Communities, which is located in South Australia. So Simon and Uniting Communities is sort of based from Adelaide, but works across the state of South Australia. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you very much, Jono.
First of all, I said to you before we clicked record that I love the diversity of our audience. We have leaders in all different sectors from all around the world. So it's always great to find out what exactly you do. So tell us about Uniting Communities, what you do as an organisation, and then also what do you do as Chief Executive?
Okay, I'll do my best to do that as succinctly as I can. Uniting Communities is a really interesting organisation. It's been around and had a few different iterations and names, but has existed in one form or another for more than 120 years. And as the name suggests, sort of grew out of what was then the Methodist Church, what later became the Uniting Church. And whilst we're quite separate from the church in terms of our governance and management these days, that's its origins. We're a broad-based community and health service provider across South Australia. But when people ask me what the organisation's about, I often describe it as a social justice organisation because we have throughout that 120 years been pretty passionate about playing a part in trying to influence more equitable and positive public policy and legislation, and we spend a lot of our time and effort, and certainly a lot of my time and effort goes into trying to influence political thinking and public thinking about things that create fairer and more just public policy. But a lot of people would know us for the services we deliver, and they really range across all demographics and pretty much all of society, from working with children and families, including in the child protection and family support space, right through to people living with disabilities. In the mental health space, providing legal services, aged care services, and a whole lot more too. We have a big footprint in working with people with drug addictions, but also in the homelessness space. And there's probably a few other areas that I haven't mentioned amongst all of that too. So really broad based. So we have a lot of touch points in the community and operate right across South Australia. We have just over 1,000 staff and about 400 volunteers that operate in those different areas that I've just outlined. And my job as the Chief Executive, I have the great privilege of sort of leading the organisation, and I know we'll talk a bit more about what that actually looks like as we go through this interview, but a lot of that is obviously keeping those services running efficiently and, more importantly, effectively to sort of achieve the outcomes we want for the people that seek our assistance for one reason or another. But also a lot of my time is spent, as I intimated earlier, trying to influence some of that public policy thinking. So, I would spend a fair bit of time, communicating with, in one way or another, politicians and those that also seek to influence politicians and their thinking. And, it's a very interesting time at the moment because we've just come out of a South Australian election, and so a lot of time and focus is now engaging with a new set of ministers and political masters, and we're in the midst of a federal campaign as we do this interview as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I find very interesting about your role and the sort of organisation you're leading is just the variety of stakeholders and passionate stakeholders across the public sector, and you're dealing with government, and of course that government are then dealing with all of their stakeholders with what they're bringing to you. But then you've got it's just it's something I find really interesting about the sector. So let's find out a bit more about your story, Simon. I'd love to start by asking you, go back to when you were growing up, your childhood. What were some of the moments or even themes from that season of your life that really shaped you into the person and the leader you are today?
Yeah, look, it's lovely to reflect on that, and it's a really interesting question. I mean, I've often, thought back in terms of my early years. I was very fortunate. I grew up in a family that's remained intact. That's always pretty important, and was lovely to have a consistent sort of set of relationships with parents and siblings. I grew up in the Barossa Valley, which is a lovely area just north of Adelaide. Some people would know from their wine collection probably, and had a pretty easy and comfortable upbringing, I have to say. I mean, nothing spectacular. Played lots of sport. Engaged in activities through primary and high school in that community before I came to university. But if I think back about the things that sort of helped to shape me as to who I am today, my parents were small business people, and I think I certainly got the value of work, but also the value of having to do things. I mean, I think, from my dad in particular, it was always instilled in me that if you were going to get things done, and they didn't have a big staffing group that they had responsibility for. They probably had about 30 or 40 at the maximum at any point in time. But he always said, look, if you can't do it yourself, never ask somebody else to do it. And I think I learnt that, early on, and it's sort of stayed with me. That is that, whilst other people might be specialists in doing things, and you want them to do the things that they do well, if it comes to, as he'd always remind me, somebody'd have to clean out the toilets, then you've got to be prepared to do that, not just to ask other people to do it. And I think that those sorts of ethics did stick with me. And I also think the value of money that I think is often instilled in small businesses and people that run small businesses has stuck with me. And so, whilst I operate and oversee quite a significant budget in the organisation I lead now, I think that I value setting budgets and meeting targets because it's important to do so. Because at the end of the day, money really does matter, and we're fortunate that we have donors and clients and customers and governments that provide money for us to deliver what we do. But we have an accountability to make sure that we deliver the best value for that. And every dollar matters and counts. And I think that when you get lazy about that is when businesses, whatever they might be doing, come unstuck pretty rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any stories from your childhood that come to mind around work ethic? It might be in a sporting environment, it might be something around home and growing up, it might be in terms of it might be another arena of life from when you were that age. But any stories around having a work ethic, that going above and beyond, that really stand out?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the work ethic, but it's funny as you asked that question. I was sort of thinking back, and maybe it was a bit later on. I can remember after when I was growing up and went to school up in the Barossa, and then came down to university in Adelaide, and then went overseas for several years. And when I first went to the UK, not knowing anybody there, but doing what a lot of Australians did early in their life to go and experience something different from what they grew up in. And I think particularly because I'd had at one level a fairly comfortable, and one might even argue a bit of a sheltered upbringing in many senses in terms of the community I was brought up in, and a lifestyle that was reasonably comfortable. And it was important in some ways to challenge myself. And I recount going there. I love playing cricket, and I always say that cricket was much better for me than I was for cricket. But I had the great privilege of playing, at a reasonable level in different places in the UK and Sri Lanka for a bit, and back in Australia. And I can remember going over there and finding a cricket team. And the first cricket team I found, it was a really interesting one in a club in North London, and it was made up of. It was a very diverse side. It had a number of Pakistanis, a number of West Indians, Sri Lankans, and English, of course. And I was the one Australian that came in there, and of course there was enormous tensions often between those different groups as to who would take precedence and take leadership. And I sort of found myself sort of assuming a leadership role very early on, and ended up sort of leading that club for a number of years in a number of ways. And I sort of reflect back on that and think that a lot of leadership is about taking those opportunities and when they arise, and not sort of stepping back and waiting for somebody else to do them. And I can probably think of other times when those sort of opportunities have arisen in a career sense, and you grab them and take them. And in some ways that's what leadership is about. It's not all of what leadership's about, of course, but it is about being prepared to get into some areas that might be a bit uncomfortable and outside your zone of what you've been familiar with. But I want to sort of look back at that was a sort of early sign that there was an opportunity to take leadership, to run that club, not just be the captain, but to sort of take leadership in terms of its everything from its finances to the way it managed itself, which I never intended to do, and I was probably only 21 or so at the time, and so it was a very good early learning experience for me.
Yeah, what are some of the specific leadership lessons you learnt from sport that you've been able to apply in general leadership?
So I was having a little laugh to myself as you were asking that question. I think the ability to lose, and I don't think I'm a very graceful loser, but the great thing about sport, of course, is you never win all the time, and sometimes you can go through periods where you're losing more than you're winning. But being prepared to actually, front up again and take the next challenge on board, and I don't think there's any sort of greater lesson than that in sport, because the reality is that no sports person is ever on top of their game always, and they will suffer losses, and some of those will be inevitable, some will be because they've made mistakes. And so part of it is about learning from that, but also being able to just be prepared to actually accept those losses and come back again and play the game the next week. And I think it's the same with leading an organisation. I mean, you're not going to get things right all the time. I mean, you try not to dwell on the things that you haven't got right, but there will be mistakes. There'll be, in our game, the tenders won and tenders lost. And, I never like losing, and I think there's always a bit of, a lot of competition for a lot of leaders. That's what drives them. But you don't want to get to a point where those losses become so devastating that you can't actually pick yourself up and take the next opportunity, because there'll be another one around the corner, any day soon, and you've got to be ready and prepared for it. And I think that's what happens in sport, and sometimes in games, particularly like cricket, it can ebb and flow a lot throughout a game, and so just sort of sticking with it is pretty important. And there are lots of times in the job I do now where I think, gosh, it'd be nice just to walk away because things have got tough. But you don't do that, because you just know, A, that's not what leaders do, but B, that good times will come.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. No, that well said. So fast forward after growing up, or even in that time, you've mentioned sport. What are other leadership opportunities early in your life that come to mind? They could be sport, they could be work, they could be where you were managing a group of people or responsible for a project. What were some of your other early leadership opportunities, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I could go back to the point I made earlier, is that, sometimes these opportunities come to you and you've just got to, see them and then seize them, in a sense. And I gave the example of that, that cricket team, that club in the UK. But even when I was working in the UK, I didn't have a designated leadership position, but I can remember sort of doing things that really took me outside of a comfort zone. Setting up an Afro-Caribbean club for elderly Afro-Caribbean citizens, and spending a lot of time just immersing myself in that culture and that group. I think when chances came to do something that was a bit different, and it was partly perhaps being at that point an immigrant in the UK, I guess I could call myself. So I know when I first arrived and I was doing some social work at that point, that there was a major strike of youth services, and young people were having to be placed all over the UK, and that caused a lot of disruption, clearly for them, but also for the organisation, the government agency I worked for at the time, to actually manage those placements. And so I just put my hand up and said, I'll manage all of the ones that are outside of London. It was a great way of seeing the country, and I spent a lot of time doing that. When they wanted somebody to be, a social worker that could work, overnights on call for any emergency, and it could be anything from, a child protection issue through to an older citizen who had or a mental health crisis that needed to be dealt with. I put my hand up and said, I'll do those sorts of shifts, because it just gave me a lot of experience and exposure and things I'd never done before. And so, in each one of those sort of cases, for me, it was a matter of just learning and immersing myself in different opportunities. When I came back to Australia, similarly, I got a job in a government agency, running or overseeing a number of their contracted programs out to the non-government sector. And I said, well, I looked at them and thought, even though I didn't really have a position of authority to change them, sort of looked at how we could actually reform them and actually get better value out of those contracts, and set up new relationships that would actually improve. They ranged everything from alternative care to homelessness. And that was a big change process, and it wasn't necessarily my job to do that. I think when I looked at others around me and my predecessors, I think they went with the flow, and it was easy just to sort of keep things going. I think always I've wanted to sort of challenge, to some extent, the status quo, and to sort of find an alternative solution. And in fact, and leaders come in all shapes and sizes and forms, and have different attributes. I mean, for me, it's always been about leading for change, and I sort of figure that if you're in ultimately when I got leadership positions where I had that authority to make a lot of those changes too, without having to always convince everybody around me that that was the way to go, it was always about seizing opportunities for change and improving things rather than just being able to manage the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. So from there, what were your, there's often those watershed moments, those aha moments from that point, and it might even be more recently in your career. Are there any aha moments that come to mind where something happened and it really formed you? It really stuck in your memory. It taught you a really valuable lesson where something went well or something went horribly, and forever it'll be ingrained in your mind. Any of those moments that come to mind?
Yeah, look, I think it was interesting when I made the move to get out of government. It was probably the best move of my career in many ways, and that's not to disparage government and people that work in it, but I knew that having the freedom to make bigger changes and things that I had greater control over, I needed to get outside of that environment. Anyway, I was working at it, and there was an opportunity to bid to become the chair or the president. I think it was called at the time of the peak welfare body in South Australia, SACOSS, and in fact I later then actually became the president of ACOSS, the National Council for Social Services as well, which gave me a lot of inroads into political circles and other major sort of federal policy making circles, and had some great experiences in that role. But just to go back to taking on that job, it was a contested position, and I'd only not long been out of government, and probably some of those changes that I'd helped to initiate and to implement when I was in government that impacted upon non-government agencies who got funding out of government probably saw me many of them saw me in a fairly negative light, because I had sort of shook the tree, and some of them had lost their funding, some of them had funding redirected, or at the very least had to do different things as a result of the reforms I'd helped to lead when I was in government. So I wasn't necessarily the most popular person, and I can remember having to do a pitch to, I don't know, there was about 30 people that made the selection of who was going to be the next president. It was on their policy council and their board, and I must have done a good enough pitch because they actually accepted me. But and many of them came back later and said, look, most of us didn't trust you, but we knew that you would actually bring about change, and that you actually had a sort of strength of conviction that the organisation needed in terms of its renegotiations and lobbying back into government. So it sort of once again taught me a lesson, I think, to say that go into areas of at that time of relative discomfort and be prepared to sort of take that challenge on board. Now, would have I learned as much as if I didn't get up? Maybe. I would have learned some different things probably, and back to my sporting experiences, I'm sure I would have dusted myself off and had another go pretty soon after that. But I probably used that to sort of propel myself in taking up lots of opportunities of leadership within the sector beyond the organisations that I am the chief executive of now. I've done a lot of work in terms of chairing or leading organisations at a governance level. So I'm currently the chair of Foodbank in South Australia and have been for a number of years. The current chair of Families Australia, a national peak body in the sort of family and children's policy space. As I said, previous president of ACOSS. So I've taken a lot of opportunity to assume, not to assume, because clearly you have to actually have a position of some credibility to take on those roles, but being prepared to sort of sometimes go out of my comfort zone and take things on and take responsibilities on, because A, I think I can make a contribution, and B, to be quite frank, I enjoy doing those things, because if leadership's not fun, then in a sense it's probably not coming naturally, you're not very good at it.
Yeah, yeah, I think it should be fun too. It can be hard though, and you mentioned that, and I love how you talked about that time where you were disrupting, and we love the word transformation. We loved, I want to be a disruptor. I want to be a disruptive leader, until you're the one who has to actually face. Yeah, that's right. Or if you're leading transformation, someone sits across from you and says, you know what, this change that you think is necessary is costing me this, and this. And you go, that's valid and true, and I still need to do it. And you lose sometimes. On another podcast episode, I was chatting with someone just about wanting to be liked that we have as leaders. I'm interested to know how did you manage that, and what have you learnt from that season about how to lead with conviction, but also with humility when you are making unpopular decisions?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think that balance is so fundamental, and if you're not sensitive, and I guess I mean, you've got to have that sensitivity is really part of your genuine personality. It's not something you can fake it. I mean, I think I have probably an advantage too of having done my base degree in social work. I've done management qualification subsequently, but I often say I'm a social worker at heart, and that makes me very much a people person and an orientation to understanding what impacts the decisions we make have on others and people. Whenever you're doing change, whether it's transformational or even small change, it's going to create discomfort, and there are going to be people that are going to feel that they're going to have a loss. And if you're not sensitive to that and prepared to listen and accept that, that's not to say that you shy away from it because of that. If you have the courage or your conviction about what you're doing as being the right sorts of change, then you've got to follow through on that. I was part of making leading a major development here in Adelaide of something that I feel enormously proud of, a development called U City, which is a 20-storey multi-use building in the heart of the city here in Adelaide, which has got mixed use and has won lots of awards for lots of different things, including its enormous diversity and its commitment to carbon neutrality and a few other things too. But to get to that point, there was a very controversial decision that had to be made of knocking down a heritage-listed church. Now, it drew a lot of criticism within the South Australian community, from certain parts of the media and others that felt that it was something that shouldn't be left alone. And I had to understand what people felt about that and not dismiss those concerns. But not be swayed to say we couldn't do it because it was more important to preserve something that wasn't being utilised and wasn't really adding a lot of value to the community, but people just loved because of its history. So you do just need to be prepared to sort of push through on things, but never lose sight of the people that are impacted adversely. You win a major tender, it tends to mean somebody's lost it. And so when that happens, if you're not sensitive to that organisation and the people in that organisation who are suffering, and I've lost things too, and I think in some ways, without loss, you don't actually appreciate just how tough things are when you actually bring about change, whether it's forced change or not. And so that balance is always critical.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I do think. I don't know if you'd reflect like this as well, but for me, so far with my career, it's been the hardest moments that I would never want to repeat, that have probably informed and formed me more than any other moment, so that I now have the empathy to work with a leader who is trying to deal with how to lead a team and is really struggling with aligning a team. I know how hard that is. I know what it's like when a team's not working well and you're pulling your hair out going, I just don't know what to do differently. And I'd never want to go back there. But
no, they're not moments you enjoy, are they? But they are, but pain is an important part of the process, unfortunately. I thought a dear friend of mine once, said that, if you haven't been sacked, I'm probably repeating a quote that somebody else made, you've never really had to sort of, examine your career and you end up becoming much more successful out of it. But, but I think what they already talked to is that adversity plays its part. And, sometimes that adversity is something that comes to you because of circumstances, but often it's because you've actually taken a chance and it hasn't come off.
Yeah, I think that's what young leaders. I think that's a message that gets lost, or maybe it's just not heard. But I think for young leaders, there needs to be this idea of celebrating failure that we talk about in corporate and and in across the world. We want to create environments where people can try things and fail. But I think leaders need to realize, don't plan your linear leadership journey from 20 to 60. Meet any great leader and you'll find that their journey was never linear, and they made mistakes. They dropped the ball. They had failures that, yes, they're painful, but they're so important. And I feel like for me, that's something that I'm learning is go out, give it a go, give it your best, and do your due diligence. But don't be afraid to drop the ball and make mistakes, because that's what's going to actually make you a better leader. And one of my favorite anecdotes that someone told me on this podcast, actually, Simon, I can't remember who mentioned it, but they said that Warren Buffett, when he puts someone in charge, is looking to hire a CEO for one of his biggest companies in the portfolio, one of the things he would always ask is, I want to know that they've made a massive mistake before. He never wanted to put someone in those sort of roles who had never really could never really point at a big mistake or a really troubling season, because he's like, I want to see how they handled that, because I don't want someone to have their first ever experience where they really dropped the ball with one of my really big companies.
One of my companies, I
Yeah,
understand that.
yeah. I thought that was really interesting. A bit of a different take on just being real enough to go. Yeah, it's not easy though. It's easy to talk about, but boy,
Oh, it
it's
is
really
easy to talk
hard.
about. We often talk about how you celebrate failures, but it is one of the hardest things to do because, and I think that's a real test of leadership too, is that you've got to really control yourself when something goes wrong. And I think, it's easy, under pressure to start pointing the finger and finding other people to blame for something. And that's the worst leadership quality you could expose, I have to say. And, nobody wants crisis. Just under a year ago, we had a major, we love to call it a cyber incident. It was a cyber attack, and, it was enormously disruptive for the organisation. And I remember somebody at the time who was heading up our area, our ICT area, saying, when it was first discovered, and it was always on a long weekend. So, I have to say, just coming out of Easter, you always feel a little bit anxious at the beginning of a long weekend when the next attack's about to come. And we've learnt lots from it in terms of security and further improvements we've needed to make. But they said to me, the organisation I was before, if something like this had happened, I know I would have spent all weekend getting bawled out by the managing director or the CEO about why did it happen and how did you let it happen and all of that. And he said, thank God you didn't respond that way. And I said, well, you're right. I mean, was I happy getting the phone call early one morning saying this had happened on a long weekend? No. Could we do anything about it at that point in terms of stopping, the incident that occurred? No. Did we have to get on and do something? Absolutely. And that's what became the focus. And I said, I'm not, blame's irrelevant and it doesn't matter. We'll learn from it. And there might have been things clearly that we could have done differently that might have prevented it and may not have prevented it. What's more important is how we actually pick ourselves up and deal with it. That's what actually will make the mark for us. And I think, I remember an old adage that somebody talked to me about, about complaints, and, it's a similar issue, isn't it? You don't want to never get complaints, because how do you ever actually learn about the sort of things that as an organisation you should be improving upon? But on the other hand, you don't want to be besieged by complaints because your organisation's not doing a good job, because that's clearly an indicator of of consistent failures. But people often appreciate what you've done to fix something much more than just providing a pretty blancmange or ordinary service in the first place. So if a mistake's happened, but you've worked your butt off to actually fix it and make that person feel better, and we had to do that with a lot of stakeholders that were impacted through that incident to assure them that we had things under control. And, I think sometimes you come out of that better than never having done that or had that experience before. It's easy to say after the event, of course. Not to say that I'm suggesting I'd like another one anytime soon.
No, but I think that's the tension. I think that is the tension, that it's really hard to lead from that tension, but I think it sounds like what the person on your team in ICT was reporting back to you was that you walked that tension well. And I think that's something that particularly young leaders or leaders who are starting out is finding that finding that ability to be early with feedback two-way. That's one thing that comes up a lot on this podcast is that the higher up you go in an organization, the less or the more control you have over the feedback that you're getting about yourself. So it's one of the greatest challenges as you get more authority, more responsibility as a leader, is to actually look in the mirror and go, okay, how do I get the feedback that I need to get? How can I give feedback early to people and not let things build up? And then when something does happen, like you just described, instead of looking for blame, how can we pick ourselves up and respond really well? And there's so much in that if we can do well in those areas, I feel like that's got to be one of the keys to being the sort of leader that people really want to follow.
Absolutely.
Well, I am having so much fun chatting with you, Simon. I've got a handful of questions, the Leadership Express questions. Are you ready?
Oh, okay. I'll brace myself.
Yeah. You can probably tell I'm a pretty gentle guy, really.
No,
So
I know. That's right. I'm not feeling too interrogated. That's okay.
the hard-hitting interrogation is the next. I'll invite you back for episode 2, and Jono, the investigative journalist.
Jono goes for the jugular. I can see it as a sequel.
So in my personality. Anyone who knows me knows that's really me. Okay, so the first question: what is a book that you've gifted to other people?
Oh, it's a good question. Look, one that we've used a lot in this organisation is Frederick Laloux. I've pronounced his name correctly, Reinventing Organisations. And we've used it, look, I'm not a big subscriber in, saying here is the book or, here's the script that everybody's got to follow. But we've really pushed this notion of self-organising teams, and we've got a long way to go to try and do that. I mean, organisations, as they get larger, naturally develop their hierarchies and, positions of power and influence that people like to hold on to. And we're really trying to challenge that and push the responsibility and accountability and decision-making down as far as we can. And, there's a few books in that sort of genre that sort of talk about organisations that have really led on in that domain and have really not turned their organisations around, but actually made them substantially different from the way organisations but most of us are accustomed to tend to sort of manage their business. And it's a hard thing to do because, you're telling people, having sort of fought all their life to actually get into management positions, that now's the time to let go. And it doesn't come naturally. But it's a good read, and there's a few others in that genre too that sort of talk about, from a company's point of view, how they've managed to actually put that into practice.
Yeah, no, it's a great recommendation. What's a big problem or challenge that you see leaders in your sector, in the non-profit sector? What's a big challenge for leaders right now in your sector?
Oh yeah, look, last year I was part of helping to organise and run a major conference here in South Australia on sort of leadership in the sector, and at it I gave a bit of a presentation on what I thought that the biggest challenge that was facing us, which was this whole sense of how do you get a balance between the passion for why we exist, which is to actually create a better world in one way or another for particularly for people who are disenfranchised or vulnerable in one way or another. But how do you keep true to that passion to make that sort of change and run a big business? Dare I say, it's almost the balance between passion and profit. And I think the commercialisation of our sector, through a lot of the big funding changes, in aged care and disability in particular, and this move to a much more market-driven model of consumer-directed care, has meant, the good thing about that is it's given people greater levels of choice to an extent over the sort of services and the sort of support they get, and control over the resources that get spent on that. But it is changing the way organisations are. I think it's making them more timid and less likely to critique governments and bad public policy. And there's been even challenges at a sort of governance and sort of looking at how organisations can even make those sorts of public criticisms and still actually be not-for-profits and keep their charitable status. So all of those sorts of things have been under challenge. But I think it is getting that balance right, because you've got to run a tight ship. You've got to, getting back to my earlier comments, money does matter, and you've got to make sure that you're making a sufficient surplus to sort of keep the business going. But if you do that at the expense of forgetting why you actually exist, then I think we should get out of the business altogether and let others run it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So, do you have any favourite questions that you ask? You're sitting in a one-on-one with someone, you're with a team, you're running a workshop. you're sitting with some stakeholders from government or elsewhere. Do you have any favourite questions that you find yourself asking a lot?
I don't know if it's a favourite question, but what I always like to know is what drives people. I mean, in some ways, that's what this whole interview is about, isn't it? From your perspective, it's what I like to know, because I always feel if you know what people's passions are, the things that really matter to them, then in a sense you can respond to them in a way that they'll appreciate, which is pretty important, and they're more likely to do things and develop a relationship that's actually going to be productive with you. But if people find out that they're interested in that you're interested in them and what drives them, and so there are different questions that get to that point. But a lot of our conversations are very transactional, and it's something we lose the sort of the person. The personality within the dialogue and the relationships we establish. So understanding what those drivers are for people, and that could be their passion for, I don't know, the footy side they support, to what their political views might be, whatever it might be. But everybody's got passions, and understanding it just, I think, changes the whole dynamic when you're relating to someone, and you're more likely to form a relationship that's going to be productive and effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any commonly held beliefs about leadership that you passionately disagree with?
Oh, yeah, probably. I mean, the one that sort of suggests that leaders have always got to be out the front, rallying the troops behind them, and that all the inspiration comes from the leader, is probably the most obvious ones. And I think a lot of our literature historically has probably pointed to leadership in that sort of sense. And the examples you see on the battlegrounds or even on sporting grounds sometimes of that person out there being the most courageous, and the one that's sort of leading from the front. And I'm not suggesting leading from the front isn't important, and clearly it is. But most change, effective change, happens because you corral people around you that have got the potential to actually deliver, and you free them to do it. So in some ways, the best leadership is getting the hell out of the way of people's ability to do things, and in some ways that sits behind the self-organising team stuff too. I mean, I couldn't do the work that our care workers do in one of our nursing homes, or or counselling, or any of the roles. And even some of them I've been trained for. I'd really struggle to do nowadays. But having good people that can do that and backing them in to do that is much more important, and I think them make the decisions about what's right. In terms of their interactions with people is much more important.
Absolutely. And I do agree that more often than not, different leaders struggle with different things, but for a lot of leaders, just getting out of the way and I remember a great analogy once someone talked about, which was this idea of the seagull. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, which is it's everything we don't want to be as a leader, because the seagull flies around far away and then it swoops in and just craps all over everything and then leaves again.
And leaves again. Steals your tips in the same process. You're right. That's right.
Yeah, and so it's I think we struggle to find that to find that balance. It's easy. I've definitely seen leaders who do that. They get removed, but then they come in and they swoop in, and it's not positive for anyone. But I think getting out of the way, really spending the time to set people up well for success, and then getting out of their way, is, for a lot of leaders, I think that could be a really helpful step.
It's one of the great challenges, I think, because often you feel, and I think early on in your leadership life, you're wanting to prove yourself. You're wanting to actually make your interventions and do stuff, and that eagerness can be an advantage. But I think, when you take over from others, you're disempowering them, and you're not going to actually help them to sort of stay on board and to continue to contribute, because I'll say, well, okay, if you want to do it all, do it all. But that's, you can never achieve things at scale that way, of course. So, that's a bit pointless. So you do have to bite your lip and step back and let people do stuff. But you still got to work out where you can add value. Otherwise you may as well not be there either. So, and sometimes that's just being a sounding board. I mean, one of the most important things I think you can do, and I think that's one of the things I've probably been okay at doing, is just asking the right questions of people when they've got ideas, just sort of challenging them from different perspectives, so they can actually see what they're actually wanting to implement or do from a number of different perspectives before they do it. And so you're helping them through some of that sort of problem solving and analysis to let them make the right sorts of decisions and then to enact them. And that's a really important role I think we can play as leaders in helping people to make better decisions.
I agree. So last question for you as we wrap up. If you could only give one piece of leadership advice to a young leader, what would you say, Simon?
Know your style, really know your style, and then use it, and use it, and use it. Now, I think we do a lot about, find your weaknesses, and you do need to be open and aware of those and work on those. But we've all got a strength. We've got an innate strength in something. It might be doing presentations, it might be, the way we do negotiations, it might be that we're, I don't know, good at consultation, we're good at, problem solving, but know it and make sure that you really play to that strength and use it well in the way that you lead, because, that's what's probably got you to the point of having an opportunity to be a leader. So don't give that up and make sure you really understand what that is. And you continue to refine it and improve upon it, but we're not ever going to be good at everything, and I know it's lovely to be a great all-rounder, and you do need to learn a lot of other skills too to actually be an effective leader, but it's the thing people will remember for the thing that you're actually you're really good at by and large. So make sure that you know it and you're proud about it, and you're able to really demonstrate and make best value and use of it.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. So for people who've really enjoyed hearing from you and might want to find you online on LinkedIn or Twitter or find out more about Uniting Communities, where can people find you online?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the website, just at unitingcommunities.org. You can. I'm very happy if people want to email me. I'm probably still do more emails than I should in my life, but if people want to find out more, make contact. So it's just Simon S at unitingcommunities.org. So pretty straightforward. Or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. And if you're in Adelaide, come to the fabulous U City, which is at 43 Franklin Street in the city. But I'd love to hear from anybody. And I think you set out by sort of talking about how we learn from all sorts of different people from different walks of life and in different businesses, and I found that too. I get a lot more sometimes out of talking to colleagues from other walks of life and other sectors than just being, I spend a lot of time with people in my own sector, of course, but there's so much more to learn from what people have experienced outside of our normal day-to-day routines.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. It's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast so much is knowing that, whether it's a head of school or a CEO of a not-for-profit or a CEO in banking in Europe, or an entrepreneur, small business. I had someone on who is an entrepreneur in Bali and has yoga teachers around the world helping people to get sober through yoga. And I love the fact that they're completely different. You would never think, and yet the leadership and business principles really do overlap, and we can learn from each other. And I love coordinating those unlikely conversations. So I really believe there'll be some people today from today's episode, Simon, who listen in who wouldn't otherwise have had the chance to chat with you, who will take something out of today and really believe that maybe just the thing they needed to hear to help them through this next season was something we chatted about today. On that note, I do want to thank our listeners for tuning in. I know you would have loved today. I've had so much fun, which is, I always say I'm listener number one, and I've just enjoyed hearing Simon's stories and wisdom. Don't forget, I also have the John O. White Leadership Podcast and the Leadership Question of the Day podcast. They're two other places that I put leadership content that you can invest in your leadership. But I want to finish today by saying a massive thank you to you, Simon, for being generous with your time and your stories. And I've just some really great leadership themes that I really deeply believe in. I think you articulated really well today. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, John. It's been a
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast as much as I did. If you're joining us for the first time, don't forget to check out consultclarity.org. That's our website, consultclarity.org, we have so many free resources on there, including our 7 Questions on Leadership series. We've had more than 1,500 leaders from all over the world in all different roles, in different industries, answer these 7 questions on leadership, and leaders give these in-depth answers around how they spend their time, a book that's been significant for them. It's just a gold mine. It's completely free to access, so go to consultclarity.org and look for that. We'd also love to interview you about your leadership. I believe your experience, your life, your context means that you have advice on leadership that other leaders can learn from. Yes, you, if you're going, not me, well, no, I really believe you would have something to add. So if you're looking for a way to give back, it's completely free to get involved. And we would love to interview you through the 7 Questions on Leadership. You just go to consultclarity.org/7-questions-interest, or Google consultclarity.org 7 questions interest and fill out the form and get involved. We have a free resource on our website called the Leadership Survival Guide. It's a 57-page ebook, 10 world-class leaders giving their thoughts on leadership, and that's completely free. It's available on our homepage, consultclarity.org, right at the top, so make sure you go and get that and download it today. And we have a free daily email that you can subscribe to. We send this out to over 15,000 leaders from around the world. And it contains the highlights of content from our podcasts, our blogs, our books we're reading. It's got the best content, and it gives you exclusive, limited, early access to our masterclasses, workshops, new products, special offers. It's all for our subscribers. You can go to consultclarity.org/subscribe and join 15,000 other leaders. And you know, my gift to you is to work really hard, particularly through the Leadership Conversations podcast. I have been blown away by the quality of the leaders, and I'm learning as much as anyone in doing these interviews. So I'm having a great time. And my gift to you is to keep lining up the best leaders I can to invest in your leadership. Your gift to me, if you're finding this helpful, there is something that you could do that would help us out massively. And that is to write a review and to leave a rating for our podcast or wherever you're watching or listening to this. I can't tell you how much that helps us out. Also, subscribe or follow. It really does make a difference in helping us to help more leaders become everything they're meant to be. Another thing that means a lot to me personally is when I see our community share our content. So if you do share this or any other piece of content on social media, then thank you, and please do that. And look for me, John O'White, or Clarity, and tag us in your post. Our team is always looking for posts to engage with from our community, and there's also a chance that we'll share your content to go beyond and share it with our followers. Last of all, you can check out my book. It's called Step Up or Step Out: How to Deal with Difficult People Even If You Hate Conflict. I wrote this book because 50% of the coaching sessions I have with leaders, this topic comes up again and again and again. And it's this idea of, how do I have this difficult conversation? How do I lead this person better when I'm finding them difficult? Or in some cases, you look and you say, I think I might be leading a difficult person. They're just quite difficult to lead, or I'm finding them quite difficult to lead. So there's a 3-step process that I unpack in Step Up or Step Out. And the amazing thing, and I've literally done this myself, and I've heard it anecdotally from other leaders as I've coached them, is that if you follow this process, you will see that person step up and change their behavior or make a decision, which is to step out some of the time. 95% of the time, people will step up or step out in just 4 weeks. And I stand by that. It's you have to read the book to understand, but I really do believe in it, and I've experienced it firsthand. It works. So you can go to Amazon, look up Step Up or Step Out John O'White, or store.consultclarity.org/book. Well, thank you so much for listening. We're going to be back with a new episode next time of the Leadership Conversations podcast. And I hope today has helped you to take another step towards becoming the leader you're meant to be. See you next time.